Okay, so today we're going to be looking into the case of Morris Solomon Jr.,
Hmm.
the Sacramento Slayer.
Okay.
And we've got two sources for this deep dive.
Okay.
We've got excerpts from his Wikipedia page,
Hmm.
and then we also have a book by Tony Ray Harvey called The Homicidal Handyman of Oak Park.
Right.
And we're going to be looking into his life
Hmm.
and, trying to figure out just what creates a person
Yeah.
who does these types of things.
Right.
Um, and, like I was saying before we started recording, it's going to be pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
But let's just jump right into it.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So Solomon's early life, I think that's always a good place to start with these things, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think, childhood is really where everything begins.
Yeah.
The foundation for everything.
Right.
It's laid there.
And in his case, it was pretty rough,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it was,
Horrific.
yeah, really bad.
Yeah.
So he was raised mainly by his grandmother, Bertha, in rural Georgia.
And it wasn't just, a strict upbringing or something.
Uh,
It was straight up abuse.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, some of the details are just really hard to stomach.
Oh, totally.
Like beatings with electrical cords, being forced to stand naked as punishment,
Oh, my God.
even being tied up during those beatings.
It's just like, how can someone...
It's unimaginable
Yeah.
to think about a child going through that and the terror that that would instill in them, to never know when that next blow is going to come.
Yeah. And you just think about, like, the psychological effect
Right.
that would have on a person, on a developing child.
Absolutely. I mean, to go through something like that, it completely changes your whole sense of safety and trust in the world.
Right.
And, makes the world seem like this really dangerous and unpredictable place.
Right.
And unfortunately for Solomon, that sense of danger, you know, didn't go away when his family ended up moving to California.
Yeah. So they moved to California hoping for a fresh start.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, who wouldn't
Of course.
after going through all that?
Yeah. They settled in this poor area of Isleton called Cannery Row.
Right.
And, I imagine they were hoping to just kind of leave the past behind.
Yeah. And just start over.
Yeah.
But
it's like the abuse followed them.
it did. It's like it was just attracted to them somehow, like a magnet.
The beatings from his grandmother continued.
Right.
And as if that wasn't bad enough, on top of that, he was exposed to, horrific domestic violence between his parents.
Can you imagine?
It's just layer upon layer of trauma.
Yeah.
It's just heartbreaking.
And, what gets me is that after all that, like, he had
Right.
what seemed like a pretty normal period in his life.
It's almost like he was trying to bury the past,
Yeah.
create a new identity for himself.
He graduated high school.
Mm-hmm.
He held down jobs.
Yeah.
He even served in the military, got married, had a child.
It's like a whole different chapter in his life.
Yeah, like a whole different person,
Yeah.
But even in these, like, seemingly stable years,
And there are hints of this darkness
Yeah.
that are lurking beneath the surface.
Yeah. And, his own lawyer, during an appeal, actually suggested that Solomon might have abused sex workers when he was stationed in Vietnam.
That's a disturbing possibility
Yeah.
that we have to consider, like what was the impact of war on someone who is already carrying so much trauma?
Right.
You have to wonder if, the dehumanizing nature of war
Yeah.
combined with kind of like societal attitudes
Yeah.
towards sex workers at the time might have created like a really dangerous mindset for him.
Yeah, it's a really chilling thought.
It is.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the long-term consequences of violence, both for the victims but also the perpetrators.
Yeah, absolutely.
What kind of scars does that leave on a person?
Yeah.
And how might those scars kind of come out later on in life?
Right. And these are the kinds of questions that I think we're going to be grappling with as we kind of delve deeper into Solomon's story and his eventual, descent into becoming the Sacramento Slayer.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a tough journey,
It is.
but I think it's an important one,
Absolutely.
If we can understand what led him down this path, maybe we can learn something valuable
Right.
about the nature of violence
Right.
and how to prevent it in the future.
I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
It's not just about this one case. It's
Yeah.
about understanding the bigger picture.
Right.
And hopefully preventing these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
So let's move on to kind of the next chapter of his life, right?
All right, let's do it.
So we've got this troubled childhood. We've got the shadow of war hanging over him.
Yeah.
And then years later, Solomon becomes the Sacramento Slayer.
Right.
Between June 1986 and April 1987, he murdered at least 6 women.
Tragic.
It's hard to even fathom.
Yeah, it's important to remember that these weren't just statistics, right?
Right.
These were real people with lives, with families, with their own stories. We have Yolanda Johnson, Angela Polidor, Maria Apodaca, Cherie Washington, Linda Vitella, and Sheila Jaycox.
6 innocent lives just snuffed out.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, and when you look at the victims,
Right.
you kind of see a pattern, right?
Yeah, sadly, it's a pattern that's all too common in these types of cases.
Right.
Most of them struggled with drug addiction.
Right.
And were involved in sex work.
Exactly.
These were women who were already marginalized
Right.
by society.
Living on the fringes.
Living on the fringes, exactly.
And that just made them vulnerable,
Yeah, easier targets
Yeah.
for someone like Solomon.
It's really heartbreaking.
It is.
It's like their lives were already filled with hardship.
Mm-hmm.
And then to have them end so tragically,
Yeah, it adds another layer to the whole story.
Yeah, it does.
It really does.
And it makes you think about all the systemic issues, right?
Right.
That contribute to this violence.
Right. When you have a whole group of people who are just marginalized
Right.
and dehumanized, it creates this climate where these types of things can happen more easily.
Yeah, it's like a whole web of factors
It is.
that all come together
it is.
to create these horrific situations.
Right.
And speaking of webs, there's this one detail in Solomon's case that always gets me right.
Okay, what's that?
He actually reported the body of one of his victims,
Oh, wow.
Yolanda Johnson,
Mm-hmm.
to the police himself.
What?
Yeah,
That's strange.
it is strange.
What do you think was going on there?
I don't know.
Like, was it a genuine attempt to do something right?
Wow.
Or was it like a calculated move?
To throw off suspicion.
Right, to insert himself into the investigation.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that,
It's hard to know for sure,
Yeah.
but it definitely piqued the investigators' interest.
Right, of course.
So they questioned him. And while, his statements were kind of inconsistent,
Right.
he did let them search his car,
Okay.
which had been abandoned on this lot where he was living.
Okay.
And that's where they hit the jackpot.
What do you mean?
They found the body of Cherie Washington buried on that same lot.
Oh, my God.
It's a chilling discovery.
Oh, it's awful.
And then just like 2 days later,
Uh,
they discovered the remains of Linda Vitella and Sheila Jaycox
okay.
in a different location, but one that was also tied to Solomon.
Wow. So they had their suspect.
They did.
But it sounds like they really had their work cut out for them,
You're right. I mean, putting together a case against him has been a real challenge.
Yeah, I mean, how do you even begin with that?
Well, this is where Solomon's defense team took a really interesting approach.
Okay, what did they do?
They didn't deny that he was involved in the murder.
Interesting.
Instead, they tried to paint this picture of Solomon as a product of his environment. A man whose capacity for violence was basically shaped by a lifetime of trauma.
It's like they were saying, yes, he did it, but look at what made him this way.
Exactly. And they brought in psychologists
Okay.
who testified about, the link between childhood trauma, PTSD, drug use, and violent behavior.
It's almost like you can't really separate the man from the monster,
Right. It's a really complex issue.
Yeah. And how much responsibility can we place on someone who was so damaged
Right.
by his own past?
That was the question that the jurors had to wrestle with.
Yeah, no kidding.
And the first jury actually couldn't reach a unanimous decision
Oh, wow.
on the sentence, so it led to a mistrial.
They couldn't even agree on whether he deserved the death penalty.
No, they couldn't.
Wow. Okay, so what happened in the second trial?
Well, the second jury
Yeah.
came back with a unanimous verdict,
That-
the death penalty.
Wow.
But then, just when you thought the story was over,
Uh-oh.
there's another twist.
There's always another twist.
What happened? After Solomon was sentenced to death, more women started coming forward
Really?
with their own stories
Wow.
about his violence.
So these women had been living with this pain and fear for years,
It seems so.
and they never said anything.
It appears not.
But why would they come forward now?
That's a really good question.
I mean, after he's already been sentenced to death, what's the point?
It's complicated, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they felt a sense of empowerment,
Okay.
knowing that he couldn't hurt them anymore.
Right.
Or maybe it was a way to, reclaim their own narratives
Right.
and find some small measure of justice.
It's a really powerful thought, right?
It is.
Like they were finally able to break free from that grip of fear
Yeah.
and reclaim their voices.
It's a testament to the enduring impact of trauma
Yeah.
and a reminder that healing, it can be a long and winding road.
Yeah, for sure.
It really is.
Okay, so Solomon ends up dying in prison in 2024 at the age of 80. But his case continues to fascinate people even today.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are documentaries, there are books that explore the details of his crimes.
Like Tony Ray Harvey's book, The Homicidal Handyman of Oak Park.
Right, exactly.
It's a fascinating read,
Yeah.
if you can stomach it.
Yeah, and I think it's, I mean, what do you think it is about this case that continues to capture the public's attention?
I think there are several layers to it.
Okay.
I mean, on one hand, there's the sheer horror
Right.
of the crimes themselves.
Yeah.
It's hard to grasp the level of depravity involved.
Yeah, it's beyond comprehension.
But I think there's also this deeper fascination with trying to understand what drives someone
Right.
to commit such acts.
Yeah. Was it just pure evil?
Right. Or was it, as the defense argued,
Right.
the tragic outcome of a life that was just steeped in violence and trauma?
Right.
I mean, it goes back to that nature versus nurture debate.
Right, exactly.
And I think that's what makes it so compelling, There's no easy answer.
Right.
And because of that, we're left grappling with some really unsettling questions.
Right.
Questions about culpability.
Yeah.
About justice.
Right.
About the very nature of evil.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, huh?
We have.
We uncovered Solomon's horrific childhood,
Right.
the possible impact of his time in the war,
Mm-hmm.
the brutality of his crimes,
Yeah.
and the lasting trauma that he inflicted on his victims.
It's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It is.
So where do we go from here?
Right.
What are some key takeaways for you from all of this?
I think for me, this case really reinforces this idea that violence begets violence,
Right.
It's a cycle that is just incredibly difficult to break.
It is. It's like it just keeps going.
And, Solomon's life was just saturated with abuse from the very beginning.
Right.
And that just shaped him in really profound ways.
Right.
Even if it doesn't excuse his actions.
Yeah, it's like a tragic ripple effect.
It is.
The trauma just keeps spreading outward.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it makes you think about, how important it is to address those root causes of the violence, right?
Absolutely. Whether it's poverty,
Right.
lack of access to mental health care,
Right.
societal attitudes that marginalize and dehumanize certain groups. I mean, we have to be willing to look at the bigger picture.
Right.
If we want to create a world where these kinds of tragedies are less likely to occur.
I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, it is.
It's not enough to just be shocked
No.
by the headlines.
Right.
We have to be willing to, actually have those tough conversations.
Yeah.
And confront the systemic issues that are contributing to these problems.
Exactly. And I think cases like Solomon's also force us to confront our own assumptions about justice and accountability, right?
Right.
Like, how do we reconcile the horror of his crimes with the understanding that his own life was shaped by immense suffering?
Yeah.
It's a question with no easy answers.
It really is.
It really challenges us to think about the gray areas of human behavior.
And to approach these issues with nuance and empathy.
Exactly. It's a reminder that there's always more to the story
Right.
than what we see on the surface. And that seeking understanding, even in the darkest corners of humanity, is essential.
Right.
If we want to build a more just and compassionate world.
Well said.
Thank you.
This deep dive into the life of Morris Solomon Jr. has been a heavy one.
It has.
But I think it's been incredibly insightful.
Absolutely.
And it definitely leaves us with a lot to think about.
It does.
So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Sounds good.
It really makes you think about, the silence that surrounds abuse, right?
It does.
And how hard it is for people to come forward.
Absolutely.
Even, years later.
Yeah.
It's
a testament to the impact of trauma, And it's a reminder that healing can be this long and a winding road.
Totally. So Solomon ended up dying in prison in 2024 at the age of 80.
Right.
But his case continues to fascinate people.
It does.
Even today.
Yeah.
There are documentaries, there are books that explore the details of his crimes, like Tony Ray Harvey's book, The Homicidal Handyman of Oak Park.
Yeah, it's
Why do you think this case, in particular, continues to capture the public's attention?
I think there's something about trying to understand
Yeah.
what drives someone to do something like that.
Wait.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, like it's
like this morbid curiosity, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's also that like true crime element to it.
Absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
a story, but it's also real.
Right, exactly.
And it happened.
Yeah. And I think, on the one hand, there's that sheer horror
Right.
of the crimes. It's hard to really wrap your head around
Yeah.
the level of depravity.
Right, the brutality.
Yeah.
It's just,
It's beyond comprehension.
it really is.
But I think there's also this deeper fascination with trying to figure out
Yeah.
what could possibly lead someone to do something like that.
Yeah.
Is it just pure evil?
Right.
Or was it, as the defense argued, the
Right.
tragic outcome of a life
Uh-huh.
that was just steeped in violence and trauma?
Right.
So it goes back to that nature versus nurture debate.
It does. It really does.
And I think that's what makes it so compelling,
Yeah.
because there is no easy answer,
Right.
and we're left with
Yeah.
all these unsettling questions,
Yeah.
Right.
about culpability,
Yeah.
justice.
And like even what evil even is.
Exactly, the nature of evil itself.
Right. So, we've gone through a lot in this deep dive.
Right.
We've uncovered Solomon's horrific childhood,
Yeah.
the possible impact of his time at war,
Mm-hmm.
the brutality of his crimes,
Right.
the long-lasting trauma that he inflicted on his victims.
It's a lot to process.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
So where do we even go from here,
That's the question, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
like, what are the key takeaways from all of this?
What are some of the takeaways for you?
I think, for me, this case really just reinforces the idea that
Right.
violence begets violence.
Right, like a cycle.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
hard to break.
It's so difficult to break free from.
Yeah, and Solomon's life was it was filled with
Right, from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Saturated with it.
right.
And I think that shaped him in
Yeah.
really profound ways.
And even if it doesn't, excuse what he did.
Of course not.
Right.
But it does help us to understand
Right.
a little bit better.
Yeah, and it's like this tragic ripple effect,
It is, yeah.
just keeps going.
Trauma just keeps spreading.
Yeah, and it makes you think about how important it is
Right.
to address those root causes of
Yeah.
the violence.
Absolutely. Whether it's poverty,
Yeah.
lack of access to mental health care,
Mm-hmm.
or societal attitudes that, marginalize certain groups.
Right.
We have to be willing to look at the bigger picture here,
Right. Yeah, and not just be like shocked by the headlines
Exactly.
and then just move on.
Yeah, we have to be willing to have those tough conversations
Yeah.
and confront the systemic issues that are
No.
contributing to these problems.
I think that's such an important point.
It is.
It's not enough to just
Yeah.
be aware of it.
No.
You have to actually do something about it.
Right. And I think cases like Solomon's also force us to kind of look inward
Right.
and examine our own assumptions
Yeah.
about justice and accountability.
Right.
How do we reconcile the horror of his crimes
Right.
with this understanding that
Right.
his life was shaped by immense suffering?
Right. How do you punish someone who was essentially, created
Right.
by their environment?
It's a question with no easy answers.
It really is.
It really challenges us to think about the gray areas
Yeah.
of human behavior,
And to approach these issues with nuance and empathy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that, there's always more to the story
Right.
than what we see.
Right. On the surface.
Yeah, and that, seeking understanding, even in the darkest corners
Yeah.
of humanity,
Of human nature.
is essential.
Right.
If we want to create a world that's more compassionate.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to
Yeah.
kind of wrap things up on for today.
Yeah, that's a lot to digest.
It really is.
Yeah,
This deep dive into the life of Morris Solomon Jr. has been a heavy one.
it really has.
Yeah.
But
man,
I think it's been incredibly insightful.
I agree.
And it definitely leaves us with a lot to think about.
Yeah, it does. So I want to thank you for joining us,
Thank you for having me.
and we'll see you next time.
All right, see you later.
It really does make you think about all the people who never get to speak up,
Oh, absolutely.
for whatever reason.
Yeah, it's like their pain is just hidden away.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that's so powerful about this case is that even though Solomon is gone, he died in prison in 2024 at the age of 80,
Yeah.
but his victims
Mm-hmm.
are still, in a way,
That sense.
coming forward and having their stories heard.
Exactly. It's like their voices are finally breaking through that silence.
Yeah. And it just kind of shows you the ripple effect.
It does.
Trauma.
Right.
Yeah. It just keeps going and
But
going.
it never really ends.
This is something we see time and time again in these cases.
Yeah.
The trauma just keeps spreading outwards.
Right. And it makes you realize that even though we're talking about one man, one killer,
Right.
the impact of his actions,
Is so much wider.
absolutely, it touches so many lives.
Yeah. So I guess, like, what can we learn from all of this?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, like, what are the takeaways? What are the things that we can kind of
Yeah.
carry with us?
I mean, for me, one of the biggest things is just recognizing that violence begets violence.
Right.
It's this cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a cycle that's incredibly hard to break.
It is. And we saw that in Solomon's life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from his childhood,
Mm.
to his time in the war, and then ultimately to his crimes, it's like...
It's all connected.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think another important takeaway is just the lasting impact of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
On the victims, but also on the perpetrator.
Right. And the fact that healing from trauma can be such a long and difficult process.
Yeah, it's not like something that just goes away,
No, absolutely not.
overnight.
Right. It can take years.
Yeah.
Even decades.
And sometimes it never fully goes away.
Sometimes it does. Yeah.
And I think, another thing to consider is that
Yeah.
we tend to focus on the individual.
Right. Like the killer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we also have to remember that there are these systemic factors at play.
Right. Like things we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. Like poverty, lack of access to mental health care, societal attitudes towards certain groups. All of those things contribute.
And it's like we can't really solve these problems
Yeah.
if we're only looking at them from the perspective
Right.
of the individual.
We have to look at the bigger picture.
Right. Exactly.
The whole system.
And I think, that's something that this case really highlights.
It does. It really does.
It's not enough to just punish the individual.
Right.
We have to address the underlying issues.
Exactly. And we have to do it in a way that's compassionate and understanding.
Yeah. And I think that's a good place to kind of wrap things up for today.
I agree.
It's been a really heavy deep dive.
It has.
But I think it's been an important one.
I think so too. And hopefully we've all learned something from it.
I hope so.
So thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Sounds good.